Right. Fabulous. So it's good to have everybody here. It's just an hour session where I'm trying to look at what's going to be ahead. We're on day 21, reminding myself of 2026. And I don't know about anybody else, but I feel like this has been an intense start to 2026. And if our resilience was tested last year, it looks like it's definitely going to be tested in the 12 months ahead. So what I'm going to do is hopefully highlight some of the issues that I've been wrestling with, things I've been dealing with clients myself, things that I've been reading through and updating on, but also looking at what does that mean? Where do we go from here? What are the things that we might need to be considering in terms of how we get prepared for and how we deal with things in the 12 months that we've got coming up? Well, just short of 11 and a half now, isn't it? For those of you, I know lots of you do know who I am. For those of you who don't know who I am, I am Amanda Coleman. I run a crisis communication consultancy. I've written 3.5 books. Shell, who's joined us on the call, has written three. So he'll probably tell me it's four now. I think it's 3.5. I've done a second edition, that's why it's 3.5. Um, and I now just work totally in crisis communication and training. And I also am the chair at the moment of the Emergency Planning Society's Comms Professional Working Group. So we try to keep on top of what's happening. We try and look at things that are coming up, and a group, this is volunteers, are producing some various bits of work, which hopefully we'll share publicly this year as well. Um, where are we? Well, there's a number of things. I've tried to pick on sort of 10 aspects that I think are sort of all coming together now to make our lives quite challenging, even more challenging when we're dealing with issues and crises and situations. And the first, obviously, is conflict, in its broadest sense, but we're seeing this play out, aren't we, in terms of polarization, across continents, across communities. So we'll look at that in a little bit, and then what does it mean in terms of how we approach things? The breakdown of trust, the Edelman Trust Barometer. I'll put a couple of slides in that came out the other day, a couple of days ago, I think. Um, and that's showing a big change in terms of people becoming very insular. And again, what does that mean when we're trying to connect and communicate and get people prepared for what might lie ahead? Um, and that's why I move on to understanding of risk. Um, we seem to assume that people see risk in a particular way, and from recent events, not sure that that's actually true, and that is how everybody sees risk in the way that some of us who are working in crisis and risk, in different formats do. So how do we communicate that risk effectively? How do we get people to see the danger, the issues, and particularly with quite distant situations? And yeah, I'm finding life this start of this year quite challenging to switch off from, and we'll talk about resilience before we finish as well, personal resilience. Um, we've also got the manipulation and propaganda. And I use the term propaganda because I do think when we look at what's happening, we are seeing this. We are seeing the way that artificial intelligence is being used, the increase in terms of deep fakes. I was looking at, and I think the figures for 2024 were something like 15 million known deep fakes that were circulating. So this is an area of huge challenge. And I think what does that then mean for how we communicate and how we approach dealing with situations? For the UK-based people, obviously the duty of candor has been talked about. I think there's some key elements around the principles of that, that I would like to see in crisis communication responses, globally, not just kind of in a legislative way in the UK, but there's some challenges around that, which we'll mention. Um, Also, then looking at what I've called it kind of a return to analog. It's like going back to some of our traditional communication methods, which are probably going to be the things we really need to focus on to get us through some of the difficulties ahead, some of the issues around manipulation and people's polarization and how they view things and how they build relationships and how they see trust. Um, the Reuters have produced a report as well this week. I'll put some of these links will be in the newsletter I'll send out at the end of the week. Um, which looks at how people how journalists see content and how things are developing. I'll mention that with a couple of slides as well about liquid content they talk about, and how things can be kind of repurposed. But I think underlying some of this is the need to kind of, with those 3 points, to analog, active listening, and knowing audiences, go back to building relationships in a ground up solid way. That definitely plays out in some of the Edelman analysis around the trust barometer. So I think we've got to start to look slightly differently at how we build our crisis plans, crisis communication plans, rather than being command and control based. We might have to look much broader at a empowering bottom up, working with communities kind of approach as well. So active listening and empowerment to build that community resilience, which I think everybody is talking about as well. Knowing audiences, and I mean knowing audiences, knowing the people we're talking to in as much detail as we can. And that leads me into some of the things I started to look at recently around cultural intelligence, which works within organizations, but also we need to think about it. And I've put a couple of slides in of things I've been kind of mulling over with that. And then the last thing, which I think is going to become incredibly important this year, is trauma-informed communication. Have we got communities that have experienced or are going through or have had trauma? And what does that mean then for how we communicate? How do we avoid re-traumatizing them? And how do we build communication that is going to be that's going to do what it needs to do, but it's going to be sensitive to that position. And again, with some of this, these are things that I am wrestling with as well as trying to kind of pull things together. So this was from the World Economic Forum's risk report that came out again towards the end of last week. Oh, Laura, get in touch. I'm always interested and to get some feedback on what you've put in as well in that. So I've just spotted that in the chat. Thank you for that. So yeah, so we're looking at where the risks are. There's been a flurry of reports, the Edelman report, or the Reuters report, and then obviously the World Economic Forum's annual risk report. Unsurprisingly, the top two, geoeconomic confrontation and state-based armed conflict. State-based armed conflict was at the top last year as well. So a lot of these, certainly the top sort of five, have been there for the last sort of couple of years. It's really difficult, and I think why I always kind of look at this is there are lots of people who are really struggling about this. What's the cut through with the situation we're seeing around Trump and Greenland and how things are developing and the discussion? Actually, when you're having conversations with people in the street and people who you meet in shops, and that's when I think actually this is having an impact. So we've got to start to think about how that impacts if we have a unrelated issue or crisis that we're dealing with, and where people's kind of mindset is. But also we need to start to think the unthinkable or think about this massive change that we're experiencing and what does that mean? Key bit for me, again, from the same report, was this interconnectivity. Any of us that have, I'm sure, been involved in crisis exercises will probably pick up perhaps one, possibly two of those. We don't really test or plan for this massive kind of interconnectivity of risks and challenges. And I think that's the phase we've got to move to. So it's not just are we testing plans, but are we building this kind of layered polycrisis sort of effect into what we're putting together. And the key as well is avoiding silos, because when you've got such a connectivity around everything, it's very easy to get caught up in silos. So when I've been doing some work recently, I'm trying to get organizations to not think functionally. So what's the risks in HR department? What's the risks in this department? But across, what's the organizational risks? And can we, in terms of reputation and operational risks, really raise it up so that this multi-layered and interconnected nature can come through in the preparation and the responses. And that also works across kind of communities and society. Are we bringing public, private sector, organisations, voluntary, all really connected and brought in? And I said in a couple of forums and training sessions recently, what I would really like to see, and it plays to kind of some of the conversation we'll have a bit later, is communities actually part of that exercising. When we've got public bodies exercising for responses to flooding or fire or whatever it is, why aren't we having the community involved in some way? And, at some points, community groups and kind of the third sector aren't even involved. So we've got to change, I think, some of the approach because it's going to really help in the long term of getting people to understand what's happening, but also to understand what that means for them and how they can prepare themselves and be ready, which no matter who I speak to, that's one of the kind of critical aspects. Still got massive issues as well. This is a UK, I know there's a few people from outside the UK, but in the UK based, and it comes out every sort of December. We've also got a massive issue in terms of trust levels in specific professions. And I found this one was particularly kind of interesting around the first time they've asked people about having a job as a social media influencer. Um, and the trust levels being only 6%, which really is kind of a juxtaposition against the fact that we know a lot of kind of what circulates from influencers is cut through and people listen to, and it does have an impact. But it's not trusted. So we've not really fathomed out exactly what lies beneath that. And I'm hoping some of the research that will start to come through might underpin why people don't trust it, but actually they do listen to it. And at the top, anybody, I think there was a couple of people who are from health backgrounds. You're in a stronger position when things happen because there's still a significant level of trust for doctors, nurses, and those in the medical profession. But again, it's this understanding that we're not in a vacuum by any stretch, the way the world is. Whenever anything happens, no matter what it is, this is the backdrop we're working against. Are you working with business leaders, and is that then going to put you in a difficult position to have to drive the communication a lot more and perhaps do things in a different way than you would if you were in a health organization when something happens. Um, so this is the kind of a couple of key. Just there's lots of stuff in the Edelman Trust Barometer. It's really worth having a look through. But I think this was the interesting bit for me around the trust and what we're seeing in terms of consistent lack of trust and a kind of depletion of trust since the pandemic, really. And what they've kind of likened it to is this insularity, sort of a reluctance to trust anyone who's different to you. And again, you can see the kind of layer that that's going to bring to communication because if you haven't got relationships, haven't got close relationships, then how are you going to actually kind of actively connect with people if you haven't got those kind of connections where they understand you, what the business stands for, what you do, and you have been able to build up that trust, then we're almost putting ourselves in a very difficult spot when something happens and we need to do that. And I'm sure everybody, well, if you don't haven't come across kind of the halo and the Velcro effects that have been written about, it's a couple of article kind of papers that are worth reading around that. This is for me where we need to kind of start to be. Challenge being, I know that lots of communications teams are being significantly kind of reduced, significantly kind of squeezed. I know from the health sector in the UK, there's been lots of reductions in teams. And actually, what we're doing is building ourselves a problem for when something happens because you haven't been able to have the resources to build those relationships in the ways that you want to. But you can see the things around the outside, what's affecting it, and what we're talking about in terms of misinformation, in terms of the legacy of the pandemic, and what is happening in the world around us. Um, and they liked it from we to me. So again, this is going to be a real challenge for cut through, and getting people to listen to what you're asking them to do, let alone build that kind of trust, so that they're going to respond in the way that you want and hope and need them to do. Um, and you can see, that it's that kind of people I know, people around me, my organization, my close friends. That's where people have got or seem to kind of build in that trust. That is a massive kind of challenge. That is where it is resource intensive because you can't globally press release things and put things out and do the kind of sweeping comms and hope that that's going to achieve what we need it to. So again, when I was thinking about crisis plans for me, this is about building that from the bottom up and making sure that we're maximizing the relationships that sometimes are in place but might not be within the kind of realms of the communications team. Um, and government wise, it's a significant challenge. If you look at the red is distrust, so significant numbers of countries where the trust levels in government are really low. And given the fluctuation, difficult change, challenging situation that we're in, this is obviously something that's in and around, and it's one of the factors that's going to impact on anything that happens over the next 12 months. Is that, am I going to listen to what governments are saying? Am I going to completely detach myself? And that's the element around sort of psychology that, again, I started to kind of try and delve into, because I think it's going to be really critical to how we build effective communication when things happen. I had to use this because I have been really concerned about what the current tensions may mean and how I might respond. Um, am I a kind of a scaremonger? I hope not. Um, but I am a pragmatist and a realist, and I am a prepper. Not in a negative way. I have things to prepare and make sure that I'm ready if something happens. Partly because I think I'd be a terrible person doing the job I'm doing if I hadn't already kind of thought of those things myself. Well, we've got to think about what's the role, what if and as, and the tensions that we're experiencing. What does that mean for us as communicators, particularly if we're dealing with difficult situations? And it makes us, I think, have more intensity. There's more challenge, and our role becomes really significant, because we've got to counter those harmful rumors. We've got to look at what's happening, and look at what does that mean for us and how we can deal with it. We've got to look at how we build and retain trust to deal with, what we've just seen in terms of the trust deficit. We've got to think about how we scenario plan, how we test, and I'm going to cover some of this in an article in the newsletter at the end of this week, because I think it's really critical that we are as prepared as we possibly can be for whatever may come from the current sort of tense situations. Um, we need to make sure we've got communications protocols that are going to work. That if we're working across agencies, that particularly thinking of like resilience forums and civil contingencies, that is as strong as it possibly can be. That people understand how to surge and move rapidly when something may change or happen. And we need to think about offline. Again, there was an alert in from the UK's National Cyber Security Centre. I think it was either end of last week or early this week, which was around cyber attacks and making sure that everything's in place that needs to be. So when I was thinking this through, I was also like, why do we get to this point? And looking at some of the kind of academic research around it, it's like the fear bit that then moves to a distorted view of threat, and how people kind of perceive that, which is then onto mistrust, defensive escalation, and conflict. So we can kind of see how things can escalate. I'm not saying that they will, but I think it's about being prepared about how they may develop. On a local level or on a global level, depending on what the situation is. So, what does it mean for us? And that's the key for me in a lot of this. Um, we've got to look at candor, we've got to look at clarity, we've got to try and reduce uncertainty wherever we can. And I'm sure anybody in a communications role knows that. It's one of the key bits around change communication, isn't it? Trying to reduce the uncertainty. So we've got to think about that in everything that we're doing. But we've also got to think about that empathy-based messaging and the emotion. Very easy to get caught up in processes, and it's not because anybody is trying deliberately to forget people, but it's very easy to when we're looking at processes and situations in that front, rather than making sure we're building an understanding of the emotion around situations. Um, we've got to try and confidence build in our messaging to get towards trust. And to counteract kind of where there's mistrust. If we want to try and counteract it, it's through that confident kind of building of what was often termed the halo, but they're a good organization, they're a good business, they're trying to do their best. Actually, it takes a different flavor given some of the challenges that we're seeing play out. We've also got to think about narrative framing. Anybody who follows or has listened to or has read any of Lucy Eastope, Professor Lucy Eastope's work, she talks about hopium, and there's a kind of balance, isn't there, between the realism and giving people something to kind of hope for. So it's got to be a kind of balance. We can't be negative, and this has been one of my challenges, resilience-wise, over the last few weeks, last couple of weeks, is it's very easy to get sucked into watching the hour and 45 minutes of the Donald Trump's press conference last night, and you know get a realism around it, but also look at the hope and the options and keep it rooted though in reality. That's one of the critical aspects. Um, and ultimately, misinformation and targeting some of what might happen or could happen or is happening in some cases is going to be down to local voices and those relationships that we talked about earlier. So it's something I'm wrestling with at the minute. Understanding of risk, and I think I might have taken that from the image from one of the Scandinavian, it might have been either Norway or Sweden's information for residents. We're seeing some of that come out now in different places. Lots of countries putting out. Poland, I know, put out some messages, kind of booklet, I think it was, for residents around how to think about it. We've got to make sure we are articulating what the risks are and risks people face and what that means in a real practical sense of what they can do. Have we got it? So, if we're going to tell people this is what they should be doing, have we thought about it? And on a session towards the end of last year, I think we were looking at, do you have a sort of preparedness bank? Like we have to have food banks in places in the UK. Can we do that so that people who can't afford to have first aid kits and all those things that they can have them? We'll see. Perhaps that's something that we're going to need to look at moving to. But also we need to look at pushing our concepts of risk. I think with the terrible Swiss fire and the fact that people were seen to be recording it rather than trying to get out of the building, just shows us that we have become very used to being behind the screen, and that impacting on how we view the risk that might be in front of us. So the concepts of risk, I think we've got to keep under kind of constant review and understanding. And I'm conscious of the time, and I'll always run out of time. Manipulation and propaganda. We've talked about this. AI-driven misinformation. The lack of governance. West Midlands Police, Shell, who were caught, using doing research and it having false hallucinations from an AI that was in there. There's a lot that we need to think about in terms of how we use AI, decision trees, verification, the governance around that. Growth in bad behaviour. We've had a few occasions with chief execs and senior leaders with bad behaviour. How are we advising them? How are we challenging that, particularly if we're going to be in a public sector body, certainly if the duty of candour does come in, and that's going to then put us into a difficult spot. The Trump effect, presenting situations. I'm thinking about Minneapolis and the videos, and I've watched that horrific, shooting a number of times from a number of different perspectives. Um, how we can, people may deliberately say things over and over again that are inaccurate just to try and kind of root a narrative. It makes our world as communicators incredibly difficult. And I watched that hour and 45 minutes last night, and a number of times heard him criticize his own PR team around the fact that people don't feel as though they're getting better off. So comms can be targeted within this as well. So crisis management is obviously going to be under further pressure. Bots, trolls, sock puppets, all those which are then driving the way people view things. And this search engine optimization's kind of dropped off a little bit. A lot more around how people is using AI for searches. Again, I think that gives us challenges of things don't disappear. Now, they never really did, but we had an illusion that it sort of dropped off. But no, because people are using AI to search, anything that has happened to you as an organization is likely to reappear. Did you have an incident or something happen and you didn't talk about it, or your response to it was limited? Because that's going to play out in terms of what people are picking up for a long time to come. In a way that I don't think we've particularly seen before. So that's definitely going to be part of our challenge. And some of this for me is that behavioral change communication that has been used, particularly was talked about around the pandemic, I think becomes quite questionable if if people are feeling as though they're being manipulated, if people are feeling as though there's kind of propaganda out there, then how can we effectively use those sorts of tools and approaches? I think we'll get kind of a lot of pushback. So we've got to think about when is it appropriate and what is the checks and balances in place if we are going to take those kinds of approaches to communication. So this was from that Reuters journalism and technology trends and predictions report that came out. And it looks at referrals from Google. So Google is as an entity is dwindling. There's a number of aspects that are looking at that. So just threw a couple of these slides in, which I thought were of interest. And then also the referrals from ChatGPT, as you can see. So where people are searching, it's a shift. It's a massive shift. And that then is obviously going to impact on things like how we do websites, how we do search engine optimization, how we respond to issues and incidents as to, my view is even when you might not want to say something, sometimes you need to because of the longevity. So it might not be relevant today and the specific response, but if somebody's going to search that and it's going to come up later, then we might have to think about those like long-term impacts. I just threw this in just again because it's an interesting consideration of content and journalism and where things are going in relation to kind of the AI generation of information and situations. And this was from journalists viewing what they think journalism should be moving into. Original investigations on the ground, contextual analysis. So it's trying to sort of shift perhaps what we'd normally see as journalists' approaches. And down to kind of that general news has disappeared off. Again, I look at these things, okay, when we've got a crisis, actually, this is going to be a different way of working, isn't it? Influencers I've talked a lot about in training I've done over the last year or so from different elements of research to say, is it going to be us win the messages out to the media to get it onto the news that's going to mean that we are doing an effective crisis communication response? Probably not as we start to move forward, because it's not going to reach the audiences, and we'll look at that in a second. And it's not going to get us where we need to be. It's not going to get us to the communities we need to get to. So are we going to have to shift our plans from us sharing to collaboration in different ways? Which does bring with it risks. I know, working with influencers brings risks, but are we going to have to do that to really achieve what we need to when a situation emerges? And I don't know if anybody saw the video that was circulating just before Christmas of the giraffe that picks the woman up and runs off with her. She's on a safari somewhere, and if anybody thought that was real, confess to it in the chat. Um, it clearly wasn't. It was clearly AI generated, as are so much of the video content that we see on social now. And even though people who were, there was, I think there was a physics kind of professor going, physics will show you that that isn't possible. The animal would fall over. It can't support that weight and the neck and or whatever. I'm not a physicist, but do you know what I mean? But yet people still were believing it. So, how do we kind of deal with some of these issues? It is around, the challenge of trust and the challenge that artificial intelligence brings. I think takes us back to what we were talking about earlier, the relationship building, so that if people are in that insular place, then we are going to need to do the face to face, and we're going to need to build the communication and into proper kind of what I would say would be sort of traditional PR, so that we are going out and speaking to people and engaging with them and connecting with them so that they can see that this isn't accurate because you're having the conversation face to face. We definitely got to find ways to get people to be more um, uh, kind of vaccinated to misinformation. We need people to spot these things much quicker, but that's going to be a long-term ask. And also, why the turn to analog? Because of the threat of cyber attacks, cyber issues, and power outages. We've seen incidents last year. We've seen a lot of cyber attacks over there's a slide that I've used in training before where it's like significant increase in cyber attacks over the last 12 to 18 months. So we've got to think about how do we communicate when we might have no technology available, we might have no systems available. And that may have thought like that's not relevant, it's going to be very extreme case, but I don't think it necessarily is now, and it's definitely something that for me that's really critical. Um, the other thing that I throw in a bit from some of the work I do is the AI generated issue. I've had situations with clients where images have been AI generated and circulating that have made me try and have to respond to it. But actually nothing has happened. So again, this is another thing for our plans and our approaches. Are we able to, and do we have a system to think of, right, okay, when that happens, what do we do? If somebody tries to say that this terrible situation has happened, and people started to believe it in the way that quite a lot of people believed the giraffe, in terms of the comments. I think it was on either Instagram or TikTok. Um, how are we then counteracting that in a really effective way? Because you can't have these things continue. Just quickly, again, anybody in the UK, obviously, this is a big piece of legislation, really demanding that there's kind of an accountability and an honesty from public sector organisations. It's stalled this week, so I've been updating this slide deck right up until the last minute. It's stalled because of some amendments that are needed around security service and disagreements. Um, is it going to come into legislation this year? I think if it doesn't, it's going to be a whole kind of issue in itself. But what I do think is it's important that even if you aren't in the public sector, that we kind of look at what's in this and what it might mean. Um, the legislation as it stands in terms of the bill, it would affect anybody working with a public sector body. So it is going to be relevant. So even like I do some work with public sector, so it would include me. And so they've got all those sort of connectivity issues around suppliers and contractors. But also there's specific communication requirements, and there's a need to, I think, be really careful around us making sure as communicators that we're documenting decisions, particularly if we disagree with, we get overruled by senior leaders, so that there is some comeback. It's interesting, as I say, like with Donald Trump last night, the people who always get blamed when things aren't quite going the way they want to is communication and PR. It's always the communication team haven't done something. And we see this when things kind of go awry. So I hope that the legislation gets into law. I hope that the bill gets into law. I hope that it means positive comes out of it, and that there is this recognition of public authorities, public officials operating with candour, transparency, and frankness right the way, particularly through to public inquiries. I hope that we start to see that as a positive. I think if it doesn't come into law, it's going to raise a whole heap of other issues, but it's certainly bringing a lot of scrutiny on what people do release in terms of information when something's happened and how they release it. Um, and I think that's the challenge that we're going to see. So, why are we withholding certain bits of information? It's why I've put a couple of sessions on just dealing with that in the training that I'm going to do this year, just because I think the impact of it can be quite significant, even if you aren't in the public sector. Who we're talking to, I've mentioned this a couple of times, and I am going to make sure we finish on time, so I'm not going to dwell too much. But it's the bit that we can do some preparation for. But then we need to be able to respond when something happens and amend and adjust it. And it's going beyond, I've been as guilty as anybody else for going, customers. It's just like a massive group of people. We've got to start to understand the characteristics of them. If we think about what we've been talking about in terms of psychology and trauma and where people are, we've got to start to build that into what we actually do, so that when we're looking at the characteristics, we're picking up those specifics. vulnerabilities, concerns, lack of trust, whatever it is around those specific groups, we can look at the communication we need to do alongside that, and what does that mean in terms of the deliverable and the final kind of output that we put together. Um, these are just a couple of ways. I mean, I use that one on the right hand side, that chart, quite a lot. But it's like finding ways to build this into your preparation, but also being alive to changing it as much as possible when something happens. Um, and the other thing the Reuters report that we mentioned talked about was liquid content, as well, being important, being able to shape and change something so that it fits different channels and different audiences. And that's definitely going to be something that we need to do in terms of maximizing limited resources and trying to do some of the things that we're talking about today. In cultural intelligence, very quickly, again, I've got some handouts that I'm happy to send if anybody wants it. Just get in touch. But I've been using it in some training. This is around. It's not just our ability to understand and relate to people from different cultures. It's also how we work effectively with them. So it takes it one step further. So it's great to know your communities and different requirements of different people. But this means, that we've got to adapt and change our behavior, our plans, how we work collaboratively, how we work empowering people, and goes beyond just being aware. There's four aspects. If you delve into what they call CQ, like it's cultural intelligence, which is you start with the drive, which is the motivation, which most of us was in communications have to understand and consider cultural intelligence. But then you've got to move it with the knowledge so that we're moving beyond biases and stereotypes. Some interesting stuff around the different biases and how they impact on how we approach things. And I find I'm to check myself a lot around those because we're not meaning to deliberately, you know, be biased in a particular way or to a particular kind of approach. But our experiences and our learning can kind of take us down different routes. So it's really good to be able to do that. It's why one of the key things in cultural intelligence, particularly in a crisis, is what they call the pause, where you take that moment and you reflect and you reassess and you think, um, and you kind of consider the kind of cultural intelligence aspects. We've got to build it into the plans and strategies. That's the CQ strategy. We've got to build it into our approaches and how we are doing things. And ultimately, then, it's got to change the kind of actions and the behavior and what we do around that. Um, oh, seeing something pop up, if that's a question, I'll catch it at the end. But this for me, I think, is where we move for that bottom up and that empowerment is we root it with some of these principles as well. Laura, love that you've done some writing around trauma-informed comms. I think we don't talk about it enough. The disaster recovery element, where are people on that kind of chart, but also where are they as individuals? And I'm currently trying to finish doing an online kind of first psychological first aid short course, which is around how you kind of help people in the immediate aftermath of trauma. It's not about therapy, but it's about kind of how would you kind of interact with them. And it's because of the way that I think it's so important to communication, is the reason that I've done it. I'm not going to be particularly putting myself into those situations in kind of recovery centres, but I think it's incredibly important what that means to how we look at communication, the trustworthiness, the transparency that we need, the listening piece, listening to experiences, understanding what that means. And we can get very focused on that initial response when a crisis occurs. What's the first thing we say? But a lot of this, the audiences and the understanding and the kind of charting things, I think is we need to build because that's what comes after. And sometimes we don't build that into the plans. Um, so collaboration, working with mutuality, is really critical, and empowerment, like we've talked about. And for me, this dovetails really closely with that kind of cultural intelligence piece as well, because if you're going to understand people, then you will recognize whether they are trauma informed or not. Are they, whether they've had experiences, whether they've had a particular issue. If it's a community that's flooded multiple times, we can't talk in the same way to them as if it's somebody that's been flooded for the first time. And I don't think we should. But that's another level, I think, of some of the planning that we really need to sort of be able to do. In terms of resilience for us, resilience for everybody, it's going to be a tough one. I just think, the way I feel it on day 21, I think this is going to be a challenging year for everybody, and particularly if we are in the response, kind of responding to situations. So we've got to think about our support mechanisms, and also how we build those support mechanisms. Again, the ground-up approach is probably going to be the most beneficial to everybody. Communities being resilient is that's what's going to support. And it came out coming out really strongly in the psychological first aid course that I've been doing is that element of it is really important, particularly when people don't trust governments and responding agencies as well. So we've got to kind of to that end. We've got to be aware of burnout that happens in communities, and what that means to how we then develop the communication when something's happened. Um, Understanding the triggers and the spans of control as well. Understanding the triggers for us, for those particularly around trauma-informed comms, but also, recognizing that I can't control some of the things that really are challenging for me. So understanding what can I do and what can I influence is important for us, but it's also really important for communities when we're trying to build resilience within them. They can feel overwhelmed very quickly. So we've got to kind of what is the really tangible and useful things that they can do to give them some kind of preparedness, feeling of control, um, particularly in very changeable situations. I'm going to pick up on the questions in a second, but I just wanted to just kind of end with a what can we do? Um, think one of the things we have to keep doing is think the unthinkable. We have to push our boundaries. We have to be prepared, even if it's challenging. And I feel like thinking about conflict, thinking about friction between countries is not a nice place to be. But if we're building the preparedness and trying to help communities and businesses find a way forward, we've got to do that. We've got to kind of keep pushing our thought processes around that. And not just that, we've got to build that into the exercises, all the things that we're dealing with that are challenging, social media, artificial intelligence manipulation, um, having to take things offline. That should be in our plans, and that should be in how we test. And I've written an article that should be in the next edition of Crisis Response Journal, which is all about how we have to bring really 2026 communication and issues into the testing and simulations and exercises that we do. It's absolutely critical. I can't see any way we can say we're prepared if that isn't part of what we're doing. We've got to talk about the risks and the readiness and make that accessible for people. And keep learning and developing. I am doing things and talking about things now that I wasn't doing 6 months ago. It's a fast-moving kind of environment, and we need to try and help each other to understand what some of the research means, what some of the academic papers that are coming out mean for us, and how that might develop what we're doing. And ultimately, is very easy for us to fall into process, plan, system, um, that trauma-informed piece, that understanding people, the psychology of how they're being affected or what they might be dealing with. That should really be what we root everything in. Because if we don't understand that, then no matter what we do, we can't say we've been effective. We can't say that we're going to achieve what we need to. So just before I kind of wrap up, um, I know, Rob, my frustration that comms teams don't always get invited, and that's part of the article is this drive to, you can't say that you're prepared, you can't say you've exercised properly if you don't bring people in. And there's another question I'm just trying to see. Would So I'd be interested in crisis communications as a different approach for types of comms, social media, etc. Social media is often not considered as a major marketing stream and an add-on. Yeah, it's true, but actually communicated via social media is the most used choice. Social media has a massive impact. I cover it quite extensively in lots of the training that I do, and understanding the changes that happen and the demographics and how people are using social media. This is why there's some really interesting research from Susan Grantham. She's Dr. Susan Grantham in Australia around TikTok and working with influencers and what that the benefits that that could bring to even go like governments in preparation for extreme weather conditions, rather than them putting the information out on their own channels. Because unless you invest lots of time in understanding the algorithms and managing things with TikTok, it's not going to bring you the results. But yet somebody who is an influencer on there could bring you better results. So absolutely, I think, social media has a really important function. Um, Understanding it in terms of triage. Are people asking for help on social media? We see a lot more of that now. People have got so accustomed to it that that's maybe through social media that they're saying, I am stuck in this position. I am vulnerable. I need help. We can't ignore them. We've also got then, understanding the tone and the kind of mood and how that's changing, as well as needing to specifically kind of address issues as and from put information out. So I talk about triaging a lot because a lot of social media is comms, and it's also customer service, and it's also kind of other aspects as well. Um, so crisis comms, if you're doing campaigns and you think you might have a reputational issue that comes up on social, flipping it on the other side, which I think is what you mentioned, then yeah, think through the risks. It's all for me about risk and understanding risk and considering risk. So if you're thinking that using, doing this piece of work, we've had a lot of advertising failures over the last 12 months or so where people have done things on advertising, and it's caused problems. So I would think through risks always. What are we going to do? What are the risks? And have I mitigated them and put things in place as much as I can? So if I've not covered something, if there's something specific that you wanted to add, that I've not covered, just come back. Yeah, Susan Grantham. If you Susan Grantham, she's an Australian academic. If you want to check out my YouTube channel, I did an interview with her towards the tail end of last year, on her TikTok work around crisis. So check her out through that because it's got some links on there as well, to her how to get her paper and stuff. He's an ex kind of practitioner, turned academic, so it is really accessible. And I have to say, sometimes the academic research is quite challenging to delve into, but actually her research is really accessible. Um, so planning resilience is an interesting, yeah, full comms calendar for planned content, but we become aware in the last few months that we need to leave room to react and recover. Totally. That's a really important point, Claire, is that we pick a lot in. You're asked to do a lot, aren't you? You're driving communications all day, every day. And where is that bit of, leeway? And also the just the basic thing of being able to pull things the immediate moment something happens. Um, yeah, I mean, I'll come. I think there's a question in the Q&A which I'll get to in a second. But I love local resilience forums here in the UK. I think the structure is really helpful. It has a really important role. But I am with you. I think there is a piece that happens now before anything gets declared as a major incident, where there's a demand for information, where people are talking about things, and the approvals mechanisms can cause issues. So I totally agree with you. One of the things I've done in training, I've done a few bits of training with resilience forums, is that bit of what delegated authority can you have, and what you have between the collective organizations. It means you can do things before it happens. We've got to have a common sense to this. Sometimes, yes, we know there are things we can't talk about. The lead agency may have to wait till they can say something, but we've got to be mature enough now to allow other organisations to say things. I keep thinking about particularly things when I think back to, dealing with significant sort of crime, terror related issues. There's so much you can't do. And yet, other organisations that are providing support, that are doing welfare, that have put centres in place, that's all things you can talk about. And that makes it easier to share information and not be seen as though you're withholding anything. So I think it's really important that we start having those conversations in those forums so that we become more comfortable with that, and that we can challenge and we can take this to senior leaders and say, this is how it needs to work. Um, when you do bring senior people and people from outside of comms into exercises where you've built in social media, where I use kind of social exercise, and it's showing what social media would look like, their attitude changes. I think they suddenly see the importance of the things that you're talking about there. So yeah, it is a challenge. I think I'm never going to go away from the fact that resilience forums do a really important job, and have a really important role. Um, but we've got to have the flexibility, and again, that goes back to training sessions that will cover some of that and that will bring that um into what we do. Okay, I'm just getting to the Q&As. So with everything that's going on geopolitically, how transparent do you think this is a really good question. How transparent do you think chief CEOs should be with their employees about what it could mean for their business? I think yeah, absolutely have to. I think this is where, we are now is that, the you you don't want to hope kind of scale. You don't want to make people really worried, but people are worried. There are conversations happening about this on a day-to-day basis. So I think it's about, being realistic around, is it going to be an issue? Is there a problem? What can we do to be prepared, to be resilient? So those are the aspects for me that I think are really, really critical. And we're seeing this play out in front of us, so is everybody else, And I think for some chief execs, it might be challenging in that they're not quite sure what it might mean. Um, Focus on what are the principles, what's the approach they're going to take? How are they going to kind of make sure people are prepared and ready and that their business can continue in the way that it might need to? So I always work on that process. It was interesting because somebody asked me about the Beckham situation the other day, which is not really my bag in terms of celebrity PR. But people go, no, 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 they shouldn't say anything. They shouldn't say anything. And you're thinking, well, they should, but it's got to be a useful thing. So I think this is with the chief execs as well. With this difficult situation, we do need them to say something, but when they do it, it's got to be meaningful, and it's got to be meaningful to their employees, particularly in that sense. Um, okay, key issues around community, society, and the lack of cohesion. But we also know we need to horizon scan. We definitely do, yeah. The mistrust now is feeding the rise in the far right, and with more authoritarian stances rising across the board. Do you have thoughts on whether we as resilience professionals should be making consideration now for how authoritarian governments will impact on? Yeah. Oh, that's a big question. How the authoritarianism, if it keeps, will impact on resilience and crisis response as and when they take power. Ooh, realistically, we should. We should be thinking about this. We should be considering what that might mean. If we're really going to be prepared, that's a tough one, isn't it? That's a massively tough one. And nobody wants to be thinking about the potential for conflict. This is why I am potentially get accused of being scaremongering when that's something I'm going to write about in the newsletter at the end of this week. Um, but I think we do need to look at what are the take all the political aspects as much as we can out of it. There are key principles about how we operate. There are key things we know help to keep people safe. And how can we enshrine them in everything we do, in the kind of fundamental piece of what we do? That's where I'm kind of trying to find positive of how we can move this forward. But yeah, it's none of this is easy, is it? Um, how do you approach external partners when there are political sensitivities or could be barriers affecting having a reliable relationship in regard to crisis comms happening across a shared county? Okay. Yeah, I know councillors posting things and causing concern. I try and flip it. Actually, if you think about what we've been talking about, councillors and people working in local areas can, not always, but can have a really good relationship. They are seen as one of the community. And this us and me, you are like me, I'm going to listen to you. They can become quite important. So I think it's almost like, how do we train them? How do we explain things to them? How do we bring them into an understanding position with particularly when we're in sort of crisis situations or emerging kind of emergencies. what's their role? Can we bring them in and ha with a role to do? Totally get that you do get people, just as you do in everything else, that may be quite problematic, that may not be easy to deal with. But I think there's more benefits to actually bringing them into the crisis communication response planning and delivery than necessarily having them kind of outside of that, because that way, that they will be doing all sorts of things. At least we can attempt to try and bring them in and maximize the local connections and trust that they might have built up. Um, but we're not in an ideal world. I totally get that some of that is problematic, and politics can play out when we absolutely need it not to. And we saw that with the pandemic, where politics often then caused problems, because people are playing for the politics rather than actually looking at what was important. That's why I think about the key principles, what's core of what we do, that will then kind of override, or be significant across. Doesn't matter what political party you are. These are the things we need to do: preserve and protect life. I would hope that no political party would say that's not important. Um, so how do you balance the need for crisis communications externally and internally? Often certain areas of social media are internal or left out. Absolutely. I mean, it's a really important aspect that internal communications doesn't get talked about as much. When you look at all the things we've been talking about this morning, or this afternoon, today, the trust bit is really important. Um, Trust within organizations. If you look at that chart from Edelman, it's around I trust my co-workers. So I think when you think about it, internal communication is going to be potentially more significant, or certainly at least as significant as anything external that might happen. But that's about getting people to understand the way the world has changed and is changing. For me, even going back some years, if you haven't got employees who are out there doing the job and speaking to people, if they don't understand what's happened, what the response is, what they can say, how can they can reassure people, how they can explain about what's happened, then you're almost like doing one thing here that's going to help and another thing over here that might cause you problems. There's a book that came out last year by a lady called Alison Arnott, who has just looked at internal communications in a crisis. So that's definitely one to have a look at, because that focuses really specifically on examples, research, case studies, etc. And if you're having a challenge internally, that might be something, there might be stuff in there that will help you to get that heard, with your senior leadership. But I think it's showing them the importance, of making sure you've got an informed workforce. And just as we were talking about councillors and politicians and a local level before, if you haven't got employees who also might be affected by it because they work and live in an area that might be affected by something, then we're going to potentially cause ourselves a lot of problems, lack of trust. And ultimately, if you don't trust your employer, as we saw in the aftermath of COVID with some employers, then people move and they will find another job. It's not an easy job market, but people will still do that if it's affected them that much. So I think again, it's what's the long-term benefits? It's financial, and kind of employee retention as well as everything else. So I hope that helps. Just to cover that, right, we've got like a minute left. So if there's any very, very last minute things, ping them in. So thanks, Christelle. In France, leaders are struggling to integrate the communication function from the beginning of a crisis. Yeah, I think it's about then looking at the structures, because structurally, where does communication sit, and who alerts it? What's the workflow? Which gets very boring about governance and workflow, but where if the call comes in, we've got a problem. Then how quickly are the communications team alerted? Because if they are able to be strategic, then they've got to be in there early. And with the speed of everything, and how things move now, that means being the third call, you know, It- it's most important bit. Um, yeah, Rob, definitely, governance is critical. So, if there's any other questions, happy to take any other questions. Just ping me a message, on social or whatever, and we can take the conversation there. I hope today was helpful. I do have training that's Oh, thanks, Laura. I'll have a look at. I think I read that actually. But I'll double check that was the article. I did find an article on Trauma Informed Comms, so thank you for that. I've got 22 different courses I worked out that I do and have done, short ones. And I've got a training plan for this year. It's all on the website that you can find. If you click on that QR code, it'll take you to the website if you don't know it. And I also have a few things I produce as well that are available, like the response kind of communication leaflet, small leaflet with a few bits of key information and some bits that you can add into it as well. So just get in touch if you want to find out that. The 10 minutes with will continue during 2026 because I really love doing it and speak to some amazing people. So it's now like the really good bank of lots of bits of research and everything else. And this the newsletter and the case studies. So I'm continuing to share those. If you're on the circulation list, you receive them. So yeah, I know that was any other questions. We've kind of done questions and at the end. Hope it was useful. Feel free to get in touch with me and we'll have other conversations after today. And thank you for joining me. We know we're going to face some difficult times. I think the key bit for us all is just making sure we keep ourselves as resilient as possible, and we make the changes that we might need to. So thank you again for joining and have a good rest of your day. It's been great to have you here.